In this week's episode, we're replacing the brakes in the 200 series. We've done quite a few Ks. We've done probably 20,000 Ks in the 200 series since we bought it. And probably 80% of that was towing our 2-ton camper. When I bought it, we bought it from a Toyota dealership. So we assumed that everything had been checked over. And when I got it, I did do a quick check over myself, and I had an independent mechanic check it when I did the tires. We've got a local tyre guy that I trust. And obviously everything was fine when we bought it, but 20,000 Ks in, the brakes are starting to feel a bit old. It's probably something I have been meaning to do for a little while, just for peace of mind, really. So yeah, this week we're gonna replace front and rear brake rotors, front and rear brake pads, and just check everything over, see if it needs anything else really. So yeah, I'll just do the pads and rotors this week, and if it does need more, I will do another episode. So first off, I started by jacking each corner up of the car and just washing everything. So I used a bit of truck wash and some degreaser. So I've just washed the inside of the wheels, I've washed the brake calipers, I've washed the wheel arches. Now this car does see a fair bit of dirt, so I just thought I'd clean that off, just so I don't have dirt flying in my eyes and have dirt on everything. So that was the first step. I didn't film that, I did that off camera, but if you're doing this yourself, I would highly recommend that you clean everything. Even if you get some wheel cleaner, that would be a bonus. I didn't have any, so I just used truck wash. Next step was I started on the rear. So we pulled the rear wheels off. I've then gone and started to pull apart. So you pull the caliper off. There's 2 bolts that hold the caliper on. You need a 17mm socket for that, so they'll come off, and you can just pull the caliper off and just tuck it in somewhere where it's not going to fall onto something or fall off and hang by the brake hose. At this stage, I'm not replacing hoses, so I would like to keep them in as good condition as I can. So all I did was I pulled the caliper off and just popped it on top of the rear axle in a spot where it wasn't going to fall off. Next step was to pull the old brake rotors off and just inspect the brake shoes inside for the drum. Now these were okay. They were in good nick. They didn't need to be replaced, which I suspected was the case anyway, just because the handbrake was fine. And just by experience, this is my 3rd Landcruiser. All 3 have had the same rear brake setup, and all 3 have not really had any issues with brake pads. So yeah, in the 70 series, I replaced the handbrake shoes and the dog bone mounts. I did a whole bunch of modifications in that, which I didn't film, but the 200 has what seems to be a better handbrake, or it's in better condition. So I knew that the pads wouldn't need to be done, because this is now my 2nd car of this generation with this amount of Ks. I just know what's worn, what will wear and what won't. So yeah, brake rotor came off. I just gave the area a quick clean just by hand. It doesn't need much. I've seen some people spray it all with brake cleaner, but it really doesn't need it. You just need to make sure there's no grease or grime on there, and just check to make sure nothing's out of place. Now these are in pretty good nick. They're all buried away in there, so there's not really much to go wrong. Next step was to attack the calipers. So I pulled the brake pads out, and the idea is, because your new brake pads are going to be way thicker than your old ones, obviously with the rear caliper, you've got 1 piston and a slider. So that piston's going to be quite well advanced because the brake pads are worn. So I do actually have a tool for this, but I don't know where it is. I think I probably lent it to someone. So I made a little tool out of a bit of flat plate, a nut and a bolt. Basically, I just welded the nut to the plate. Drilled a hole in the plate, welded the nut on, and you got yourself a piston pressing tool. So I used an old brake pad still in the piston, and I wound it in just to push the piston back into its resting place, into its home. I have seen people suggest that you undo the bleeder. Now, I've tried it on one side and tried it without on the other side in the name of science, and it doesn't make a difference either way. So if you leave the bleeder closed, you're going to push the fluid back into the brake reservoir. If you open the bleeder, when you return the piston, it's going to push fluid out of the bleeder. If the car had done 200,000 Ks or 150,000 Ks or more and hadn't had the brake fluid done, I would not recommend pushing it back. I would recommend pushing it out of the bleeder. Because the brake fluid on this would have been replaced quite recently, probably just before we bought it as part of routine maintenance, it looks pretty fresh. I knew beforehand. I was happy to push the fluid into the reservoir. So once we've returned the piston to its home all the way flush, we're able to just give the area a bit of a quick clean. So just make sure you don't have any brake dust in, the piston area. You don't want it to get sucked in. Just check to make sure your sliders are greased. Now, these looked to me like they were done before we bought it. So everything's okay. Now you can start reversing the order. So you can put the pads in, put the new rotor on. You do need to clean rotors. When they're brand new out of the box, they'll have an oily film on them. So I went ahead and got some brake cleaner and just sprayed the hell out of it. So spray that, give it a wipe down, rotor on, brake caliper on. Just make sure you got enough room to slide the caliper on, put your bolts in. So those two bolts with the 17mm head, so they can go in. There is a torque spec for that, but I just tightened it with with a breaker bar. I'm sure the torque setting would be 100 and something Newton meters. I just made sure they were tight because it's something I'm going to check quite regularly anyway. If it's something that you're not really going to check, if you're just going to drive the car and not look, you probably want to go and look up the torque settings. Maybe I'll put it on the screen below. So I'll put the torque setting below once I find it. Now that we've got our brake rotor on, our caliper in with the fresh pads, obviously we're going to put the wheel back in and drop the car on the ground. Next step is to work on the front end. So obviously you've done your 2 rear brakes. We're going to move on to the front. So I only filmed 1 brake per end just because you don't need to see me do it twice. So caliper comes off, brake rotor comes out. Now, one thing I didn't mention for the rear is both front and rear brake rotors will have a threaded boss in them. So if you use it's an M8 by 1.25 bolt, you can thread that in and it basically pushes against the hub face and separates the brake rotor from the hub. Now the brake rotor is going to be a snug fit, so you will need to do that. You won't be able to pull it off. So brake rotor off, your caliper's already off, you pull the pads out. Now, one thing I stumbled across with this car was the rear was fine. The fronts, however, everything was quite corroded. So the pins that go in and allow the pads to slide were corroded. And everything was just caked in what I thought at the time was rust, but I've recently come back through and checked and it's just caked on dirt and brake dust. I was able to punch out the first 2. On the other side that I didn't film, I ended up having to cut the pins out, or cut one of the pins out after I punched them through. So for this job, I cleaned the pins back up. I just stuck them in a drill and turned the drill on while wire brushing them. I will go back later and replace those pins with fresh ones. I've since ordered a whole bunch of fresh, genuine parts for it. So pins out, brake pads can come out. Now is a good time to clean and inspect. So you want to check the rubber boots that surround the pistons. You want to check to make sure your bleeders are still in good condition. Now these are still flowing, but again, I've ordered more just as a spare. You want to check to make sure there's no loose bolts that hold the 2 calipers together. I wouldn't go and check them with a spanner or anything because there's seals in between. But if they look like they're loose, then obviously you're gonna have to either rebuild or replace the calipers. So once everything's cleaned up and inspected, at this stage I noted that because of all the built up gunk, they needed a whole lot of cleaning. B, getting the pads out, because of the gunk, the pads were quite well stuck in there. They need to be able to move freely. All right, this is my first time using these DBA pads. Normally I'll use Bendix ones, which I'm pretty sure, yeah, I did do in the 80 and I've done in other cars before. These look really nice, except when you go to put them in, because there's so much crud and stuff on the caliper, I've given it a scrub. But what I've found is there's a little bit of paint on the sides of this brake caliper. Let's see if I can get a better shot. Just here, it sort of sticks out a bit more. I've checked these against the old pads and they are ever so slightly wider. So what I've done is I've put like a cutting disc on my angle grinder, put this in the vise and just taken the paint off. I haven't taken any steel off, just the paint's slightly too thick to get it into the caliper right. Now the caliper has some springs in it, little steel washers that sit up against the sides of these, which locate the pad into the caliper. But it still needs to be able to move and flex and stuff. So I can get it in, but you're gonna have to jam it. You're better off just trimming the paint off ever so slightly. If you're not comfortable doing that, you probably shouldn't be doing your brakes. You should be taking it into a mechanic. I've done hundreds of thousands of brakes, not just cars. I've done motorbikes, I've done push bikes. Half my job as a push bike mechanic was sorting out braking issues. So this is something I'm super comfortable with. There has been plenty of times where I've modified brake pads to fit calipers. It's just part of what needs to be done. So just don't take too much off, just enough. You just want to take the paint off and that's it. So pads are out, or pads have been out and cleaned. I needed to just pretty much put the pads in, put everything back together, and then new brake rotor goes on after you've cleaned it. Caliper goes over the brake rotor once you've put the pads in. Obviously do your bolts up. Make sure you don't miss anything. So where the hose runs between the body and the caliper, there's a bolt and a bracket halfway that stops the brake line or the brake hose from entering into the front strut. You're gonna have to pull that off to remove the caliper to clean it. When I put it all back together, I forgot that. So make sure you put that bolt in. I ended up being able to climb under the car and getting the bolt on first, getting the bolt on anyway. But make sure you don't forget that part. So everything's back together. You've tightened everything. You've got the wheel on. You've checked to make sure all your wheel nuts are tight. Next thing to do is to start the car. Check to make sure your brakes are grabbing. So obviously pump your brake pedal. I didn't let any air into the system, so I was able to just, the brake pedal was fine from the get-go. So I was able to just start the car and drive it, basically. Next step is to go for a bit of a drive and complete a bed-in procedure. Now, these brakes came with a bit of instructions, so I recommend reading the instructions or doing a bit of research. My bed-in procedure was basically, I just went for a quick burn around town. I was sitting at 60, I slowed down as much as I could, 20, 30k an hour, sped back up, slowed down, sped back up, slowed down. I didn't do any hard, sudden braking. I did that for probably 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, came home and then just drove the car normally. Now, these brakes recommended that you don't tow for a couple of 100 Ks. We didn't really have a choice. The next weekend we were due to take the camper out, so we ended up towing with it anyway, but we took it easy. Anyway, that's how you replace the rotors and pads on these 200 series. I will come back next week and tidy a few things up. So we've got some new pins, we've got some new fitting kit. I was meant to paint these at the same time, which I will do next week, just because they needed a fair bit of cleaning up. I've also noticed that there's a couple of torn piston boots, so we're going to replace those. I'll order a rebuild kit anyway and just see what I get to. but it looks to me like they're just dirty really. So anyway, if you think of something that you would like to add to this, please add it in the comments. If you've liked this video, let me know about it. If you've liked the channel, please like the videos you watch, subscribe to my channel, and yeah, thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.